I'm Bookface, and welcome to our spooky special of the year. So today, we're talking about a monster with some very recognizable origins, but some details that really change things up. And if you've played Resident Evil Village, you might have actually heard of this one, if you weren't, too distracted by certain other things. And with that out of the way, let's jump right in. So today we're talking about the Varkalok of Romanian myth. The name relates back to an ancient Greek form of vampire called the Varkalakis, which is a whole nother can of worms. A very large can of worms, I might add. Oh, hey, smile worm. The creature itself has been compared to the Nosferatu of Romanian myth. Yes, that kind of Nosferatu. And that's also a video for another day. Many believe that certain details in the legends of the Varkalok could mean that it's some sort of Christianized retelling of Fenrir from Norse myth. So yeah, no big deal, they're just the giant world-devouring wolf, but this one is Bible approved. So the Varkalok is described as an undead creature with pale, dry skin, and while it's generally described as wolf-like, it can actually take a number of different forms, including, but not limited to, dogs, cats, spiders, fleas, a pair of dogs. Yes, the resource specifically states a pair, not just a singular dog. I don't know why sometimes they choose to split off into two dogs, but is there mitosis in my werewolf legends? Again, some animal smaller than a dog, because that's not vague at all, and is at this point that I am quoting directly from my source, black children. What? Which I'm really hoping just means, like, shadow people, and that it's not just some profoundly racist detail. I'm using the exact words in my sources. I do not know. Really banking on shadow people here, and, you know, it's quite a circumstance when I'm really asking for this answer to be shadow people. There's also another notable form, but that one needs a little more context, so we'll just put a pin in that. So naturally, when it comes to monsters, one of our first questions is, where does this thing come from? Oh my god! With the undead, we kinda have a vague idea, but what is it that makes the difference between a corpse turning into a Varkalok versus turning into mush? Well, people who committed suicide were considered more likely to become Varkalok after death, though sometimes it was actually thought the Varkalok wasn't an undead necessarily, but a demonic spirit that would possess the dead. Out, demon! Specifically, they would try to possess the bodies of infants who died unbaptized, or whose parents were unmarried. Other times, however, the Varkalok were children stolen by witches, or who just didn't have the proper Christian rituals performed after they were born. It was also often believed that the seventh child in a family was doomed to become a Varkalok, and sometimes being a Varkalok was just a genetic thing. But those aren't the only circumstances that could cause a Varkalok to become an issue. But I separate these last two because, they're definitely unique. So apparently one thing that could allow a Varkalok to rise is sweeping dirt out the front door of a house at sunset in the direction of the sun. Okay. Another risk was if you're making maize porridge and then you put the porridge stick in the fire. Why? The others have things you could consider like numerology, societal standards, religion, ideas of morality. This is the most arbitrary and weirdly specific thing I have read. I didn't even know a porridge stick was a thing before this. After rising, the Varkalok will remain attached to its grave for 7 years, sleeping during the day and going out to hunt at night. They drain small amounts of blood from their victims and leave no visible mark. And if this is allowed to happen 9 times, then the victim dies. I don't really know how you'd track that. So all that's some nice folklore-y monster stuff, but here's where things go completely off the rails. Now, if you'll recall, I mentioned there was a connection between Varkalok and Fenrir. Though, more specifically, I think the connection lies with the Varkalok and Hati and Skull, the sons of Fenrir that chase the moon and the sun, respectively, trying to chomp down on them. Well, in the same vein, Varkaloki, which is what you call multiple Varkalok, are seen as enemies of light who also try to consume the moon and the sun. And it was thought that eclipses were caused when a Varkalok, or many Varkaloki, nearly succeeded, with the change in color being the moon being covered in bloody wounds. Another interpretation of the Varkalok's attacking of the moon, however, was the idea that God sent the Varkaloki to attack the moon specifically to lead people to repent. Man, that's a strong tactic. Now, points if you noticed, both of those things only mentioned them attacking the moon, not the sun, even though they're enemies of both. Well, don't worry, the reason for that is very simple. There's a lion guarding the sun. Naturally. My personal nerd note is that in alchemy there's a very common symbol of this green lion devouring the sun, which doesn't exactly relate perfectly, but I felt it's worth mentioning since, you know, lions don't come up at any other point in this. Okay, but if you're as pedantic and debatably stupid as me, you probably got a very funny image of this horrifying wolf monster free-floating in space snapping its teeth fruitlessly at the moon. Or a bunch of wolf monsters standing on the ground snapping their jaws up at the sky trying to bite the moon, because It's way up there. It's a little out of reach. So how does this monster with a very solid physical form attack the moon? Well, according to Heinrich von Wlislocki, it's because the moon is inhabited by many Varkalaki. Moon's haunted. And while this does sort of push away the other images I had, it does not stop me from imagining a bunch of werewolves on the moon angrily biting at the ground. And yeah, it's still pretty funny. Others, however, believe Varkalaki attack the moon by placing themselves into a deep, almost death-like sleep, and using a form of astral projection called midnight spinning. Interesting thing, though, they don't just appear like a foggy version of their physical forms or some spooky ghost wolf. No, that'd be too easy. This astral form is described as either a dragon or some amorphous, ill-defined creature covered in mouths. What kind of Lovecraftian nonsense is going on here? Also, somewhat related to this, but in a weird way I don't quite understand. In the interpretations where the Varkalok is a warning sent from God, they're prompted to attack the moon if women spin, like spinning cloth, not just spinning in circles, at night, and or cast magic spells. These Varkalaki would persist until the string being spun was broken, at which point they descend back to heaven. And yeah, between the biblically accurate angels and these things, heaven is a lot more metal than I think we give it credit for. Long story short, you don't want to deal with a Varkalok. So how do you keep these things from popping out of the ground like daisies? Well, if our potential Varkalok is someone who committed suicide, the body needs to immediately be placed in running water. And kind of wondering how many bodies they just lost in the river like that, and that was their excuse. Varkalok, you know. Problem solved! Good day, citizen. And after a body is buried, planting a thorn bush on the grave keeps them from rising. I do kind of wonder if that has some kind of connection as to why roses are commonly depicted being placed on gravestones. I mean, like, I know there's a bunch of symbolism with flowers, but I don't know, the idea that it could also be a precautionary thing. It's just interesting. But we can't always be so proactive. At least that's what my procrastination keeps telling me in my brain. But thankfully there are ways to stop a Varkalok that doesn't boil down to fist fighting a supernatural creature. It's thought that a Varkalok may sneak into a house through some small opening, and if this opening is then plugged, it forces the Varkalok to take some straw form. I don't know if it turns into just a pile of straw. I imagine like a little straw doll. I'm not sure. It doesn't really clarify. Maybe it turns into a cool bendy straw. Who knows? Now, if you take this straw thing and burn it, it sends the Varkalok onto the afterlife. But if you don't burn it and leave it for 7 years, the Varkalok is banished to the moon and then sent straight to hell following the next lunar eclipse. Oh boy, I thought I procrastinated. Now maybe you catch a lucky break and you find a Varkalok resting, or your Winchester instincts kick in and you've got a Varkalok that's relatively restrained. Well, if the Varkalok is a male, you need to cut the heart in half, drive a nail into the skull, place either a whole bulb of garlic or quicklime in the mouth, cover the body in the fat of a pig slaughtered on St. Ignatius Day. And man, if I had a nickel for every time I needed to use the fat of a pig slaughtered on St. Ignatius Day to stop a supernatural creature, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird it's happened twice. Check this video if you don't believe me. Then you wrap the body in a burial shroud that's been sprinkled with holy water. Finally, you take the body to a subway? And finally, you take the body to a secluded location and bury it. Whew boy, that was in-depth. That's a whole day's project. But, as I said, that's all for if you find a male Varkalok. So what about a female Varkalok? Well, in that situation, you would drive iron forks into the eyes and heart, and then bury them in a deep grave. Well, that seems a lot easier. But let's say you've really been going through it recently, and you haven't really processed the whole Varkalok issue until it's staring you right in your face. Well, you could try to ward off the Varkalok with things like garlic, fennel, incense, and holy water, which would help to keep it out of your face at least. Maybe instead you look outside and you're like, I didn't hear anything about an eclipse. Oh, crap. Well, if you're worried that the moon is about to be devoured and the world destroyed, all you gotta do is scare off the Varkalok with loud noises, including, but not limited to, banging shovels and utensils, tolling church bells, or playing lutes and fiddles. And while this potentially cataclysmic situation may seem like a really, really bad thing, it does pose a unique possibility. See, if you'll remember, during the whole midnight spinning thing turning into the giant eldritch monstrosity to attack the moon, the Varkalok's body is sleeping, meaning that this terrifying monster is completely vulnerable, and all you gotta do is move the body. Then its astral form won't be able to find its way back. None of my sources say what happens after that, but I'm guessing the astral form just kind of dies or dissipates from not having a host to link it to the world. That or it just hangs around and gripes for the rest of eternity.
I knew I should have taken that left turn at Albuquerque.
And there we have the Varkalok. If you want to look through my research and sources, as well as my drawings, then check out my website in the link below. I don't really deserve to be paid for this, but if you disagree for some reason, I do have a Patreon. And of course, if you liked this video, then please leave a thumbs up, comment down below, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye!